What if one small promise could follow you for 40 years? In 1967, during the Vietnam War, a U.S. Marine met a little boy in the streets of Hội An. The boy didn't beg for food or candy like the others. Instead, he simply pointed at the soldier's wrist, at his watch. The Marine laughed and said, "When I come back, it's yours." But war has a way of tearing people apart. The Marine never returned to that town. He went home, built a career, raised a family, and yet, through all those years, he carried that same watch with him. Most would have forgotten, but he didn't. 4 decades later, he boarded a plane back to Vietnam. Not for war, not for duty, but to find that boy, now a grown man, and finally keep a promise made in the middle of a war zone. A soldier and a boy, December 1966. Phil Seymour was 20 years old when his boots first touched Vietnamese soil. He arrived not as a tourist, not as a visitor, but as a sergeant in the U.S. 1st Marine Division. His world then was chaos. Firefights, patrols, the sound of helicopters cutting through humid skies. But war is never just bullets and battles. It's also the small, quiet hours between. And it was in those moments that Phil's story began. Stationed near Hội An, he and his fellow soldiers often rode across the river into town. The narrow streets were alive with children, their laughter rising above the tension of war. Most came running toward the soldiers, not with fear, but with curiosity. They tugged at their uniforms, asked for candy, begged for cans of meat. And the soldiers, young men themselves, found joy in giving. Among that lively crowd of children, one boy stood apart. His name was Cam, though Phil simply called him Cam. He was about 9 years old, thin but strong, with a gaze that carried both shyness and pride. Unlike the others, Cam never begged. Instead, he arrived with offerings: bananas, coconuts, limes, a fair trade for the soldiers' rations. That honesty, that small act of dignity, made Cam unforgettable. Phil often noticed the boy hanging back quietly while others scrambled for gifts. If he had nothing to trade, he simply smiled and watched. His presence was calm, almost grounding, amid the chaos. Then, one afternoon in June 1967, Phil told Cam he was going on leave, a short trip to Thailand before returning to duty. He crouched down and asked gently, "What would you like me to bring you back?" The boy hesitated. His English was limited, his world small. Then his eyes shifted to Phil's wrist. "The watch," he whispered. Phil laughed. He promised the boy he would bring him one. True to his word, he bought a new watch in Thailand, small, sturdy, perfect for a child. He tucked it carefully into his gear, ready to hand it over. But war doesn't care for promises. By the time Phil returned, missions had changed, orders were different, and circumstances pushed him away from Hội An. He never saw Cam again. Still, the watch remained with him, carried across battlefields, across oceans, and eventually back home to America. Most soldiers left their memories of Vietnam locked away, too painful to revisit. But Phil's memory was tied to a single face, a single smile, and a promise unfulfilled: the weight of time. Life after war took Phil down a path of service and success. He stayed in the military, climbing the ranks, 27 more years in uniform. Along the way, he earned a master's degree in law, became a lawyer at the Pentagon, then rose to chief prosecutor before finally retiring in 1995. He had a wife, Lynn, and together they built a good life: stability, achievement, respect, things so many veterans longed for. But amid all that accomplishment, one small object remained tucked away: the watch. Most people would have forgotten. It had been a child's casual request, made in broken English during a time of war. And surely, after 40 years, that boy would have forgotten too. But Phil had not. For him, the promise represented something larger. It was innocence in a time of brutality, a bond of trust across cultural and political divides, a reminder that even in the darkest days of war, humanity had found a way to shine through. He often told himself, "I'll die with this watch in my drawer, never delivered, always unfinished." and that thought weighed heavily on him. Then, in the winter of 2007, fate offered a chance. Friends of Phil's family planned a trip to Southeast Asia with a stop in Hội An. It had been over 4 decades since he had last set foot there. The streets, he knew, would be different. The children grown, the town rebuilt. But still, he felt he had to go. Packing his bags, he slipped the watch inside, along with old photographs of Cam's family. He carried no guarantees, only hope. When he arrived in Hội An, the town was buzzing with life. Tourists filled the streets, lanterns glowed over the river at night, and markets spilled over with color and sound. Yet beneath the modern face of the town, Phil searched for traces of the past. With the help of a local guide, he began asking questions, showing photos, describing the boy he once knew. It seemed impossible. 40 years had passed. A boy of 9 would now be nearly 50. Who could remember such a small detail from so long ago? And yet, persistence paid off. One afternoon, the guide led him to a modest home. There they met a man, not Cam himself, but his younger brother. The brother listened quietly as the guide translated Phil's words. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes, he remembered. And yes, Cam was alive. A meeting was arranged. The reunion. The next day, a man walked toward Phil. He was no longer the barefoot boy of Hội An. He was 49 years old, a carpenter by trade, his hands rough from labor, his face marked by time. It was Cam. At first, he looked puzzled, almost wary. Who was this foreigner, this American, standing before him? Then the guide explained. 40 years ago, this man had been a Marine. He had known a boy named Cam, and he had carried a gift, a watch, ever since. Cam's expression froze. His eyes widened. Slowly, realization swept over him. He remembered. He remembered the soldiers who came into town. He remembered the one who often carried a little dog on his back. He remembered the laughter, the kindness, the sense of adventure amid war. And though the watch itself had faded from memory, the man standing before him did not feel like a stranger. Phil reached into his bag. His hands trembled as he pulled out the watch, worn but intact, its ticking heart still alive after all these years. "This is yours," he said simply. Cam stared. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. At last, Phil pressed it into his palm. 2 men, once separated by war and oceans, embraced. Tears blurred the decades between them. For Phil, the weight lifted at last. "If I had broken a promise to an adult," he explained later, "I wouldn't have carried such regret." But to a child who never begged, who always smiled, who gave more than he took, that was different. The watch was never just a gift, it was a bridge. And from that bridge, a new chapter began. Phil and his wife Lynn grew close to Cam's family. When they learned that Cam's daughter, Vi, had left school due to financial hardship, Lynn quietly stepped in to help. 5 years later, in 2012, Phil and Lynn returned to Vietnam once again. This time, it wasn't for a reunion of promises past, but to celebrate Vi's graduation. They bought plane tickets for Cam and his wife so they could travel to Saigon. It was Cam's first time on an airplane. He brought with him gifts from his hometown. Simple things, yet filled with love, and hosted a small party in his daughter's dorm. In that joyful gathering, laughter replaced the echoes of war. The watch had become more than an object. It had become a symbol of friendship, of family, of 2 lives forever intertwined. The promise that endured. Promises are fragile things. They are made in moments of hope, of innocence, sometimes without thought for the weight they carry. And too often they are broken, forgotten, or buried beneath the years. But this story reminds us that some promises survive. They linger, tugging at the heart, waiting for the day they are finally fulfilled. For Phil Seymour, a simple promise to a 9-year-old boy defined something essential about his humanity. It was never about the watch itself. It was about dignity, about respect, about the ability to see a child not as the enemy, not as a stranger, but as a friend. When he placed that watch in Cam's hands, 40 years of regret fell away. and in its place stood something stronger: connection. Today, Vi, the little girl whose future was changed by that connection, calls Phil and Lynn often. She speaks not as a stranger to benefactors, but as family. Two families, once separated by war, now linked across oceans and generations: a soldier, a boy, a watch, and a promise that proves, even in the shadow of war, kindness can outlast time itself.